a little introduction, saying how he realizes that, well, that way of thinking was useful and necessary at that point, but it may miss something. And what he means is this story about, if you're building yourself like this, and you're an autopoietic system like a cell, and then you interact with the world, and these interactions are not representations of the world, but are like perturbations, that may lead to a solipsistic way of looking at things. Like he said, no, actually, we're missing something, which is the history of how interactions and constitutions are co-determined. And what I've done in the past has an influence in how I'm constituted today, and how I'm constituted today has an influence in what I'm going to do in the future. And that is what was missing. And so you can see that the evolution of the line of thought here, and he says that this perspective of co-definition is what he has recently called in action. So let's look at this passage more clearly. Now, a little bit of technical terminology here. So you may have heard them naturally sometimes talk about autopoiesis, autonomy, sense-making. These are technical terms. There's a whole thing to be said about why sometimes you need to define new terms, but maybe we leave that to the discussion. One term that I want to introduce is the term autonomy, which is technically in the literature. And that idea is related to a systemic concept. The concept is called operational closure. I'll explain what it is. You see here lots of blobs. Imagine these blobs, and you're an experimenter in the lab, and you're very curious, and lots of things are happening, and there are lots of measuring machines, and things are going on, and you start recording different processes, changes of variables, things that you're interested in. Let's imagine that each of these processes that you're looking at is one of these blobs. You see the temperature in the room, you see the nice in the street, and so on. And then you start intervening to see the relations between them, and you find that sometimes you find interesting relations between these processes. So when you intervene here, there's an effect there. And not only that, let's imagine that effect, you discover which effects are really enabling effects. Like, actually, if this wasn't here, this couldn't happen. And you do this study for a very long time, until you realize that at the level of your observations and whatever you're interested in, some of these processes have an interesting topological property in terms of their enabling relations. They form a closed network, and that means these are the yellow ones. They have arrows going out from any of these processes to other yellow ones, and arrows coming from yellow ones into them. And that is, in a way, in which we can say that that is an operational closed system. It is self-enabling in the sense that these processes, if we consider them as precarious, that they need the network to continue to exist. And this is the concept of autonomy. There's don't worry if it is, we don't need to have a full grasp of this at the moment, but just to illustrate to you how dynamical systems ideas can help us build new concepts. And autonomy in particular, in the case of material processes, material biochemical processes, is manifested in this concept of autopoiesis, the self-production of life. And life, we usually use an icon like this, where we have a self-sustaining network of processes that are, if the network was not organized this way, these processes would all dissolve. They are precarious. And an environment that is interacting. And part of the process is going to be to critique this very picture that we use so much. So paradigmatic case of autonomy, therefore, is minimal forms of life, like bacteria and so on, but all forms of life at some level have a disorganization. And the interesting, complicated question is that when life gets more and more complex, you see forms of closure at many, many levels. And this is why the idea of autonomy is so useful. Let me say something more about autopoiesis. I say it, but I say it very quickly. But it's important because it's a fundamental aspect of all life. The concept itself has a technical definition, and so it doesn't matter. But it says something like this. An autopoietic system is a network of processes by chemical transformation that have two properties. One property is that as these processes operate and run, they regenerate the conditions by which they can continue to exist. So that they're supporting each other, you know. And this happens in chemistry a lot, like autocatalytic sets and so on. There's no magic there. It looks a bit circular and strange, but it happens. And condition 2 is, well, these processes as a whole, they build a topological unit. They create a distinction between them and not them, the environment. Typically, in living systems, that's a cell. So there's two conditions, self-production and self-distinction. I will say why that's important. In 2002, this paper by Paolo, they want to do something major, which is naturalize cognition in terms of autopoiesis. And say, look, it may well be that if you follow the arguments of Kant, like the self-organization of life and so on, and express them in these systemic terms, you may well have a naturalization of cognition, because you may say, look, the living system is in the world, and that world is valence. It matters whether that living system is able to interact in such a way to renew the nutrients flow, or if it's put itself at risk, and so on. And therefore, we have a normativity emerging here. I wrote a paper saying that's a great idea, but it doesn't work. And it will work, however, if we add something to it. And it was the notion of adaptivity, another dynamical systems concept. And it will take me a little while to go into that, but adaptivity simply means, imagine that your system, has a boundary viability, another dynamical systems concept. The states and relations by which that define that your system is viable. You cross that boundary, the system dissolves, it dies or ceases to be. And if you cross it, if that happens, that's too late. So autopoiesis cannot really evaluate whether you cross the boundary, because by the time you cross the boundary, it's already no longer there. So you have to have mechanisms that are sensitive to the tendencies of your trajectories in space state and in relation state. Space. And somehow respond to that before the crossing of the boundary. This is what we call adaptive behavior. And from here we can look into trying to define agency. Another piece of work we've done based on these ideas, and we propose that there are three, because say, well, naturalizing cognition, so you should be able to tell us what an agent is. Yes, we should try. There are three conditions for agency, which we call precarious individuation, normativity, and asymmetry. I will explain them. Individuation is this thing of the system coming up by itself, and we don't never really talk about agency unless there is an agent. And there must be some agency going on, although, yeah, even that would be criticized sometimes. An agent does a thing in the world, so it has an asymmetric relation. It's not simply coupled to the world, but sometimes, not all the time, sometimes it also acts in the world, does things to its surroundings, changes them. And it does so in normative ways. Well, it doesn't because of a reason, not simply randomly. So when you look at asymmetry in particular, you can also define it very specifically in dynamical systems terms. I'm trying to answer all the questions that were given to us to see how we use dynamical systems. So you can define the system as a couple of equations that define the state of this entity, the state of the environment, a couple, and say, well, but can you define an agent like that too? Well, yeah, we can describe what an agent is doing. For instance, the asymmetry condition, we can describe it as, in also dynamical systems terms. I mean, essentially it says, there are some parameters in this coupling, in these arrows, that if you can describe that there are changes in these conditions that are induced as a consequence of the states of this system, and this is what this arrow means, then if those are modulations of the environment, of the coupling with the environment. You're no longer just simply you're not only coupled with the environment, like planets are coupled with the sun, to each other, but there are also there are ways in which this coupling is being modulated by the system. Not all the time. As I said, this capability should be there for something to be called an agent. And this modulation should happen normatively. The agent should be doing this in terms of trying to be adaptive and making sense of the situations. But you see that if you go from autopoiesis, that thing that I said at the beginning is like, well, it seems a bit abstract. You have self-production, you're making yourself, and self-distinction, you're making a boundary with the environment, like a cell membrane. Imagine these two conditions, and look at them individually for a moment. Say, like, well, self-production, I mean, what would be the best way to self-produce? I mean, how can I best make use of all my surroundings? Well, it would be great if I could just, use everything as a positive input. For the bacteria, anything is food, and nothing is bad. And nothing is poison. In order to do that, you should be able to accept every input from the environment. And the end of that is that you should, if you were only self-production, you should be like an open system. And when that is no longer a living system, totally open, it's gone. Self-distinction, what would be the best way to achieve that on its own? You say, well, I don't want anything to, threaten my integrity. Well, I would build a big wall around me, such that there is nothing coming from the outside that I don't want. And then self-distinction, the best condition for it would be, separate yourself from the environment, and that doesn't work either. But you see, these two, each of these individual tendencies, it negates the other conditions. So these conditions are related dialectically. And the resolution is to extend this tension over time. And the extension over time of that is the concept of agency I introduced earlier. So you see, the concept of agency is like, okay, I will accept adaptively certain relations to the environment, but I will also be able to reject those things that are threatening. And then that may be a balancing act. That may not always work. But that's what I will have to do to continue to survive. So you see, this is what I mean. You have a concept here, autopoiesis, that was very basic in the history of narrative thinking, but that concept has become more concrete. It has more determinations now. It's a concept of agency. Okay, we'll speed up because I'm looking at the clock. So we move from this situation in the classical autopoietic theory to this situation in the narrative theory. So what I say, so this is the idea of concreteness. When I say bodies are more concrete than machines, what would be my bodies? Well, let me say something about the human body. It does not exist. There is no human body, the human body. The human body, is one of the most culturally varied constructions that we can think of. And the particularly Western flavor of human embodiment is that there is such an abstract thing as a human body. And it's not innocent, because whenever, just Google human body and look for images, and you will see, just human body, nothing else. You will see that we're talking about a typically adult, typically male, typically white body, and typically not doing anything, just standing there. So, this is a self-criticism, and in sensory motor life, you still will see many instances of the body. And so I myself, when the body is like this and like that, and then we're realizing now that this is even though the bodies can be, differently able, gender, have a history, be involved in socioeconomic conditions that define them, that you know it well, and I think everybody would agree with that, and yet, when you use the phrase the body, you're inducing in yourself a little bit of forgetfulness of that, and then you just keep on thinking about, well, the body, there must be something like the body. It's not. What we have is bodies, and what I'm not going to talk about is sensory motor bodies in the next part, and comes from the book. Here, I wanted to just say this thing, probably, I'm sorry I didn't see. The processes that individuate the sensory motor agent acts themselves. So we have the living cell of the living body and so on. I want to say that the sensory motor agency is a different body. Not a separate body, not disconnected, but it's a different concept. And the paradox is being constructed by what it does. So there's obviously antecedents to this idea, and one that I really like is by Susanne Langer, because it also induces some connection to the last part of the talk. The trace, the development of the mind, and blah, blah, blah. What we need is a more fertile concept than individual, self, organism. These things are, nouns that are very, very, induce this way of thinking, it's very general and abstract. What we need is a principle of individuation. To understand individuation as something that is a process that consists of acts, happenings, events, textures of activities. To say more about that, I will move on. So it's almost as if we're saying, not so much that we have constitutional interaction that are code-defined historically, but she may actually be saying in this level that it's interaction, it is the doing that constructs the doer. That may be paradoxical, but let's see. Perhaps if you understand it like this, like two aspects of two determinations of the body we put up. So I go into a little bit where we engage, we took ideas from Piaget's theory of equilibration and tried to redescribe them or rethink about them in analytical systems terms. So you have the typical Piagetian scheme here, right? Baby drinking from the milk bottle. I want to highlight that each of these sensory motor coordinations is always a meeting of trajectories of sensory motor dynamics and environmental dynamics. These are things in the environment and things in the body that they can regenerate the cycle, and that story. Briefly, you have a dynamical systems approach to this, where we describe dynamically, in terms of set theory and trajectory, the conditions of the transition between one sensory motor coordination and the other, as the conditions that, if they broken down, can be described as obstacles of lacunae in Piaget. So it's a dynamical systems description of Piaget's, but it does highlight some differences, or well, not so difference, but it does put in the foreground some aspects that are not always interpreted this way, like the multiple participation of the environment and the organism. So we say that there is accommodation, there's plasticity, and we think of plasticity in the developing organism, the developing child, but there can be plasticity in the environment too, the way you organize your space around you, you're working, that is plastic, and you are moving, changing the conditions for the sensory motor loops to appear. Go quickly through that, this is simply how it goes. So the interesting thing here is that even in that book, we say, we still think in these terms. There are conditions for the actions, for the A's and A primes, the B and B primes. And these may be described according to your interests in terms of agent, side, properties, motivations, intentions, skills, or environmental side properties, affordances, risks, solicitations, and so on. And we think normally that goes like this. And when these come together and a scheme happens, and that creates a new situation, That's the act described in this way. And that seems to be pretty straightforward. Well, I want to say that actually, and this maybe answers the questions of the ontology, I don't know, maybe, something else may be actually happening here, or maybe more useful to look at it this way, is that you have all kinds all kinds of relations and potentials and intensities and events happening in the body and in the environment that at some point get concretized into a particular form of interaction, a particular coordination that happens just there, at that moment. And then it moves on to more, and again, the phases of relations and potentials and so on. Whether these things that we call motivations, intentions, and so on, were preceding, or were actually realized right there at the point, is a question that in each concrete case we should investigate. But we should not assume the answer. That's what I'm trying to say here. And this is, again, described in the dynamical system terms, is a passage from metastable conditions to a dephasing condition where things become clearly separate and then they become again relational and so on. So that is what I want to call the act, and this is what I will call an event too. Something happens, that's what an act is. So looking back at that, you can see that these A's and B's may not be always fully there, actualized, individuated, right at the moment, and in turn, what you do will have effects in the world beyond the effects that you see as the act, the conclusion of the act. So that seems very trivial, but it's not trivial when you start thinking about acts as events. They have effects in the world that are not the effects that you're looking for. You know, I'm moving back and forth. There's a swinging movement here, and I don't really want to. I mean, the water is moving when I move. You don't see it, but I see it. Not the effect I want, but happens. And this is important, and we'll see why. Because these effects may feed back somehow on those conditions. So we say in an action that we bring forth the world by our actions. We do things and we construct the world. Well, this is a very clear case of how we do it. Not only do we construct the world by having loops that affect the conditions, our actions can affect the conditions that give rise and enable those actions. We also affect our own bodies. So we may have the enactment of certain movements and so on are likely to make the same movement recur. And if these conditions are precarious, we call that a habit. But they don't need to be just the one habit that's sustaining like this, but it could be networks of schemes related to that, such that they're connected by enabling relations between each other, apart from maybe also functional relations. And eventually what you have is this big network that continues to grow over development. And that structural network, whenever a particular action is performed, that network is there. So essentially when you're going to perform this particular sensory motor scheme, there is already a functional activation of the things that normally would accompany that, or normally should be inhibited in that moment. So each action is not isolated, it's always part of a network. And consider a simple action like pressing a button. Well, you press a button, it seems like it's always the same action. No, it's not always the same action. Embedded in different contexts, it's a different action. You press a button on the elevator, when you press the alarm button, or when you're pressing this spraying gantry thing, and you have to press it in a different way, with different intensities. And if you don't believe that, you can already see that the middle picture seems rather fake, because you never press alarm buttons like that. Yeah. If you're in a situation of an alarm situation, you don't go to press the button, wait for somebody to take a photo. So that in itself, that you can already recognize that when you look at an action, there is a certain reality, a certain truth about it, or if you want to use that word, or maybe a certain, there will be something not quite right about it, and what is not quite right is that it doesn't fit the embeddedness of other acts that correspond to that particular situation that we recognize as such. So, in the end, we have these big networks and so on. And what I want to say, and this long argument, is that these networks achieve operational closure. These networks are networks of acts and networks of schemes. So they're not only part of your body, they're part of your body and your surroundings. And each of these are clustered according to activities. When Francisco Varela talks about micro-worlds, it's the activity of being, a genre of activity like cooking or walking down the street or waiting. And many of these activities will be very much influenced by your environment, obviously. And the idea is that if this is the network that becomes the closed network, and it generates its own normativity, and it will be a bit long to explain why that. This is a sensory motor agent. It's no longer that organic agent anymore. It's enabled by the organic agent, but it's a sensory motor agent. And that, again, if you look at experience, as we always do in action, it's always look back to the experience. We don't care all the time about remaining alive. We care about other things. We care about, performing or acting in a good way, in an efficient way, in a pleasurable manner, whatever. And that level of worry and care must have relation to a particular normativity, which is sensory motor normativity. And it's the integration of this network that is the ongoing construction of the sensory motor body, the sensory motor age. And this induces a particular view of how these clusters relate. So if you take an activity like in a cigarette, and this is an example given by Nikolai Bernstein, you see that there are lots of sensory motor coordination, sensory motor schemes implied, but there is no order sequence necessarily in which these things must happen. There are some relations that must be respected. You cannot put out the match without lighting the cigarette. That won't work. But there is an adaptive variability also. So each of these, and other people have investigated this, and people in this room actually, you get backgrounds to this idea of networks of habits or networks of schemes that keep developing. Not only Nikolai Bernstein, but in ethology, John Fentress studied patterns of networks of behaviors in rodents, in wolves, and has wonderful studies about Kurt Fischer. We heard the first day a lot about also how he conceives of this evolving network of schemes that may take different paths. And in computational neuroscience, people like Mark Large too, they talk about each scheme only makes sense within the context of a network of schemes. I think I'm going to mention that quickly, but I want to say something about how this metaphor helps understand commitment, the committed state, and the actual expectation state, but I'm not going to have the time. I'm not going to have the time to say much about a little model, because I know this, I will run out of time. I want to say something about about this guy. I don't know if he's familiar with this. I mean, it has like millions of followers on YouTube, so some might be here. Okay, this is a wonderful series of videos called a channel called Primitive Technology, where this man in Australia goes into the rainforest and with what he finds starts building stuff. And builds an axe, a hand, and then he builds a house, he builds a fire, he ends up smelting iron. So it's wonderful, and it's a great, every time I watch this, it's like a great example of all the abstract things I've been talking about, of how you create your environment, and then your environment feeds back to you, and how the actual trying is the way you really learn by doing it. It's a wonderful series of examples. I want to just quickly mention, if you take nothing else from this talk, at least let's just go on. So, yeah, that simply summarizes what I just said. And this is another summary of what you said, the business of different human bodies, because these networks evolve in just rapidly and in totally different ways. So there is nothing that is a body as a thing. And bodies are enacted together. That's something else. I realize I won't have much time. I need to speed up. So we heard about participatory sense making, the work we've done with Anna. And this is where we have social interaction, not just agents interacting, but with the environment, but with each other, and we define social interactions using dynamical systems terms again, in terms of the autonomy of the agent must be conserved while we interact, but there's also an emergent autonomy in interactive configuration itself, using autonomy in this technical sense. So there's, again, how do sensory motor networks develop? There's a lot of work here on longitudinal studies, and some of the people are here, that looks at the first year, this study following the first year of life, and you see first you have this very synergistic, mother-infant interactions, synergistic schemes that you could describe metaphorically as a network that's very connected, and then that's when the baby is looking at the toy, touching the toy, taking the toy to the mouth, and so on, and the mother is trying to disequilibrate that by saying, look at me, look at this other toy, and so on, and eventually that creates a moment where the mother can create a little bit of separation between holding the toy and looking at the mother and doing other things. And that, mothers being mothers, they're not happy there, and they say, well, no, now you're too distracted. Let's keep playing with just the one toy together, or something like this. And then this creates the, a concentration and the normativity that emerges in each of these clusters, like picking up, touching, even, etc. So, all I want to say is that this network metaphor is useful in thinking about these things. And also, you know, have heard from Lily Vermont and colleagues, and this is a work I also take from this work from the 70s and 80s, but I realized that it continues to this day. Of 6, 7-year-olds going through the Piagetian tasks together in interactions, like conservation of objects or moving things about and reproducing a plan. And they